MELES ZENAWI, Part 3: The Mind, Vision, and Developmental Legacy of an African Leader, by Haile Shishaye. The Other Side of the Legacy. A serious historical documentary must not turn MELES into a flawless hero. That would weaken the argument rather than strengthen it. MELES's government faced serious criticism concerning democracy, political freedoms, press freedom, and human rights. Human Rights Watch documented political repression and restrictions on political participation during the 2005 election period. The Committee to Protect Journalists also documented significant restrictions on independent journalism and arrests of journalists. The violent aftermath of the 2005 elections remains one of the darkest episodes of his political legacy. MELES himself later acknowledged the deaths and said he regretted them, while arguing that the government had faced a challenge to the constitutional order. Therefore, the historical verdict should be nuanced. MELES demonstrated extraordinary developmental ambition, but development cannot be the only measure of leadership. A truly successful African state must ultimately combine economic development, justice, institutions, accountability, political freedom, and national cohesion. That is one of the lessons the next generation must learn. The great paradox of MELES ZENAWI. This is what makes MELES such a fascinating historical figure. He was simultaneously a revolutionary and a state builder, a development strategist and an authoritarian ruler, a powerful African diplomat and a controversial domestic politician, a believer in national transformation, and a leader whose government restricted political space, a man who expanded infrastructure and human development while facing serious allegations of human rights abuses. History should not erase either side. Instead, history should study both, because the objective of studying great leaders is not to create saints, it is to understand what made them effective and what ultimately limited them. Number 18, why his death was so significant. MELES ZENAWI died in Brussels on the 20th of August 2012. He had been receiving medical treatment abroad. The Ethiopian government announced that he had died from a sudden infection while recovering from an undisclosed illness. International reports cited Western officials who believed he had been suffering from liver cancer. The Committee to Protect Journalists reported that international sources said he had died from liver cancer. However, because the Ethiopian government did not publicly confirm the underlying illness, the responsible historical formulation is MELES died after a prolonged, undisclosed illness, with the government officially attributing his immediate death to a sudden infection. International sources reported liver cancer as the underlying illness. He was only 57. That is perhaps the saddest part of the story. A man who had spent much of his adult life thinking about Ethiopia's future was suddenly gone. Number 19, what Ethiopia lost. Ethiopia did not merely lose a prime minister. It lost a particular political mind. A leader who understood the machinery of government. A leader who had spent decades building political networks. A leader who knew the history of the country. A leader who understood the opposition. A leader who understood the military. A leader who understood regional politics. A leader who understood international diplomacy. A leader who could sit across the table from major world leaders and argue Africa's case. Whether one admired or opposed him, his intellectual presence was difficult to ignore. Number 20. Could MELES have prevented the later Ethiopian civil war? This question must be treated carefully. MELES died 8 years before the Tigray War began. The war erupted in November 2020, following years of political tension, disputes between the federal government and the TPLF, disagreements over elections and constitutional authority, and the broader transformation of Ethiopia's political system after 2018. The conflict became one of the most devastating wars in modern Ethiopian history. Nobody can prove what MELES would have done had he lived until 2020. Therefore, it is historically safer to say MELES's continued presence might have changed the political trajectory, but no responsible historian can prove that he would have prevented the war. What can be said is that MELES possessed a very different political style and a deep understanding of the internal architecture of the EPRDF and TPLF. His death created a succession that eventually produced major changes within the ruling coalition. The EPRDF later dissolved and was replaced by the Prosperity Party. Political tensions subsequently intensified. Eventually, the federal government and TPLF entered armed conflict. The lesson is therefore not simply Ethiopia needed MELES. The deeper lesson is Ethiopia needed institutions capable of surviving the death of any individual leader. That is an even more important lesson for Africa. End of part 3. Part 4 begins with section 21. The great lesson: never build a country around one man.